On the morning of May 15, 1945, at Glucksburg Castle, located 3 kilometers north of Flensburg, Germany, Paul Nitze began what would become one of the most consequential interrogations of World War II. As vice chairman of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Nitze had traveled to this location to question Albert Speer, the man who had managed Nazi Germany's war production for 3 years under relentless Allied bombardment. Albert Speer, 40 years old and impeccably dressed despite his status as a prisoner of war, had served as Minister of Armaments and Production since February 1942. Paul Nitze, 38, was a former Wall Street investment banker who had entered government service in 1940. The war in Europe had ended 8 days earlier with Germany's unconditional surrender on May 7th at Reims, France. Nitze conducted the interrogation alongside economist John Kenneth Galbraith, who would later become a prominent Harvard professor and author. George Ball, future Undersecretary of State in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, had been leading survey teams across Germany, examining bombed facilities and interviewing industrialists. The interrogation carried urgent importance for ongoing military operations. While the European war had concluded, fighting continued in the Pacific theater. American military planners estimated that invading the Japanese home islands could result in 500,000 American casualties or more. The effectiveness of strategic bombing needed to be understood quickly to inform the ongoing air campaign against Japan. The Strategic Bombing Survey had been established in November 1944 by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, following a directive from President Franklin Roosevelt. The mission was to determine what effects strategic bombing had on Germany's ability to wage war and to apply those lessons to operations against Japan. For 7 days, Nitze and his team questioned Speer for approximately 5 hours each day, with sessions sometimes extending into the evening. Speer arrived each morning prepared to cooperate fully, having calculated that providing valuable intelligence to the Americans might protect him from more severe war crimes prosecution. Speer presented detailed statistics about German armaments production under his leadership. When he assumed control of the Ministry of Armaments and Production in February 1942, Germany produced approximately 15,000 aircraft annually. By 1944, production had reached 39,807 aircraft. Tank and self-propelled gun production increased from approximately 4,900 units in 1941 to around 27,000 in 1944. Ammunition production more than doubled during this period. These figures presented a significant paradox. Germany had been under sustained Allied bombing since May 1942, when the Royal Air Force launched its first 1,000-bomber raid against Cologne. American daylight precision bombing began in August 1942. By mid-1943, the combined bomber offensive was striking German cities and industrial facilities continuously, with RAF Bomber Command conducting night area raids, while the United States Army Air Forces flew daylight precision attacks. Speer explained the comprehensive measures implemented to sustain production under bombardment. These included dispersal of manufacturing to small workshops scattered across countryside locations where bombers were less likely to find them, transfer of entire facilities to underground locations such as converted mines and railway tunnels, ruthless prioritization that reduced civilian production to zero to free resources for war goods, redundancy in supply chains, ensuring that destroyed factories could be compensated for by others, improved industrial processes developed under pressure, streamlining of designs to simplify assembly and reduce parts count, and extensive use of forced labor from occupied territories. The turning point, May 12, 1944. During the interrogation, Speer identified a specific date that marked the beginning of Germany's irreversible decline, May 12, 1944. On that day, 935 American heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force struck German synthetic oil production facilities in the largest concentrated attack on petroleum infrastructure executed to that point. The primary target was the Leuna synthetic oil plant near Meersburg, Germany's largest producer of aviation gasoline. Other major facilities at Politz near Stettin, Brooks in occupied Czechoslovakia, Bolin, Zeitz, and Lutskendorf also sustained heavy damage. Before the May attacks, Germany had produced 316,000 tons of aviation gasoline and petroleum products in April 1944. By July, production had fallen to 107,000 tons. By September, it had collapsed to less than 50,000 tons. By December 1944, fuel production had become catastrophic. The consequences were comprehensive and devastating. The Luftwaffe could not maintain operations. Pilot training, already reduced to dangerously low hours, was curtailed further due to fuel shortages. New fighter squadrons received aircraft but remained grounded due to insufficient fuel for training and operations. Panzer divisions faced similar constraints. Commanders had to choose between using limited fuel allocations for training or saving it for combat. When Germany launched its final major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, German planners allocated barely enough fuel for attacking divisions to reach initial objectives. The operational plan explicitly counted on capturing Allied fuel depots to sustain the offensive beyond the first few days. When this failed, entire panzer formations ran out of fuel in the Ardennes forest and had to be abandoned. Other bombing campaigns. Ball bearings. Regarding the famous raids on Schweinfurt, which produced most of Germany's ball bearings, Speer indicated these attacks had not achieved their intended effect. American bombers hit Schweinfurt twice in 1943, with the second raid on October 14th costing the 8th Air Force 60 bombers and 600 aircrew. However, Germany had stockpiled months of supply before the raids. When production dropped, German engineers substituted simpler bearings in applications not requiring high precision, and imported bearings from Sweden and Switzerland through channels that remained open despite the Allied blockade. Transportation networks. Attacks on transportation infrastructure became increasingly effective, particularly in the final months. By February 1945, the Ruhr industrial region was completely isolated from its coal supplies. However, these attacks only became decisive late in the war after Germany was already losing primarily due to the fuel crisis. Despite sustained attacks on aircraft manufacturing facilities, German aircraft production peaked in 1944 at 39,807 planes. Speer explained this apparent contradiction by noting that factories were dispersed, production moved to underground facilities, and assembly was broken into smaller steps performed in workshops difficult to target. The fundamental problem was not production capacity, but fuel availability. Germany produced thousands of aircraft in 1944 that never flew a single combat mission due to lack of fuel and trained pilots. Between January and May 1944, 22,262 German fighter pilots were killed, wounded, or went missing. March 1944 alone saw catastrophic attrition, with entire squadrons decimated. Jagdgeschwader 11 lost 28 pilots in 3 weeks, while Jagdgeschwader 3 lost 31. The numbers illustrated the story of annihilation. Germany could lose 10 fighters and struggle to replace them within a month, while the Americans could lose 100 fighters and replace them within days. The industrial capacity, pilot training pipeline, and strategic situation were fundamentally unequal. D-Day and the final collapse. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Luftflotte 3, responsible for defending France, had 481 aircraft available on June 5th. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe managed to fly 319 sorties, while the Allies flew 14,674. The disparity was so complete that many Allied soldiers did not see a single German aircraft during the first week of the invasion. Oberstleutnant Josef Priller, commander of Jagdgeschwader 26, was one of Germany's most successful fighter leaders, with 101 kills. On D-Day morning, Priller and his wingmen were the only German fighter pilots to attack the invasion beaches directly, flying two Focke-Wulf 190s at extremely low altitude. Their two aircraft constituted the entire German fighter response to the largest amphibious invasion in history. The weeks after D-Day saw some of the most desperate air combat of the entire war. By the end of June 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost over 300 fighters in the West, July losses exceeded 400, and August losses approached 500. By July, Galland was receiving casualty reports showing 50 fighter pilots killed or missing every single day, while training schools graduated approximately 30 pilots per week. The mathematics of annihilation were simple and stark. There was no way to sustain operations at these loss rates. Galland's relief from command. In January 1945, Galland was relieved of his command as General der Jagdflieger on January 13th. Göring blamed Galland for the Luftwaffe's failures, claiming constant complaints and defeatist reports had undermined morale. The relief came after what became known as the Fighter Pilots' Revolt, when several senior fighter commanders met with Göring to express grievances about the conduct of the air war. Galland was placed under house arrest and faced possible court-martial or execution. However, Hitler intervened, recognizing that court-martialing Germany's most famous fighter race would be a propaganda disaster. Hitler allowed Galland to return to active duty on the condition that he form and command Jagdverband 44, an elite jet fighter unit equipped with Me-262 aircraft. Galland accepted immediately and gathered 10 holders of the Knight Cross, experienced aces who had survived years of combat. Among them were Johannes Steinhoff with 176 kills, Gerhard Barkhorn with 301 kills, and Heinz Baer with 220 kills. The Me-262 possessed exceptional capabilities: a top speed of 540 miles per hour, 4 30mm cannons with devastating firepower, and the ability to reach 30,000 feet in 7 minutes. In combat, the Me-262 could choose when to engage and when to disengage, as Allied fighters could not catch it in level flight or in a dive. Galland flew his first combat mission in the Me-262 on March 31, 1945, shooting down a B-26 Marauder near Nuremberg. Over the next 4 weeks, he added 6 more kills, all heavy bombers. His squadron destroyed 45 Allied bombers and fighters during March and April 1945. However, these achievements made no difference to the war's outcome. Germany was collapsing from all directions, with Soviet forces fighting in Berlin and British and American forces advancing rapidly through Western Germany. The fuel supply had essentially ended, and even elite jet units were grounded for days due to lack of fuel. The final mission. Jagdverband 44 flew its last combat mission on April 26, 1945. Galland led 12 Me-262s to intercept American bombers. At approximately 1500 hours, while engaging a formation south of Munich, Galland's aircraft was hit by fire from a P-47 Thunderbolt piloted by First Lieutenant James Finnegan of the 56th Fighter Group. The attack came during a vulnerable moment when Galland was focused on setting up a shot against a bomber. Rounds tore through his canopy and instrument panel, and both engines were hit. Metal splinters struck his right knee. The aircraft was severely damaged but still flyable. Galland broke off the attack and nursed the crippled Me-262 back towards Munich-Riem, managing to crash-land near the airfield despite barely controllable aircraft and a destroyed instrument panel. The injury was severe enough that he could not continue flying, and he was removed from command. Johannes Steinhoff took over Jagdverband 44. 8 days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The aftermath. In 1979, 35 years after the war, Galland met James Finnegan at an Air Force Association meeting in San Francisco. A graduate student had matched Finnegan's combat report with German records and arranged the meeting. The two men discussed the engagement in detail, and there was mutual respect between them as professional military pilots who had done their duty in a terrible war. Adolf Galland survived the war and was captured by Allied forces, spending time as a prisoner until 1947. After his release, he worked as a military advisor to the Argentine Air Force for 6 years, then returned to Germany in 1955 to work as an aerospace consultant. He published his autobiography in 1954, which detailed his experiences and conflicts with Göring and Hitler over air strategy. Galland lived until 1996, dying age 83. In interviews throughout his life, historians asked Galland about the turning point of the air war. He consistently pointed to August 1943, the moment he tried to warn Göring about long-range American fighters penetrating deep into Germany. He knew then that the Luftwaffe faced a threat it could not overcome if leadership refused to adapt. Galland argued that if the Luftwaffe had adapted in August 1943, when P-38s with drop tanks first appeared, perhaps different outcomes were possible. Perhaps more resources could have been allocated to jet fighter production, training programs could have been expanded, and tactics could have been developed to counter Allied numerical superiority before the pilot corps was decimated. However, Göring had refused to acknowledge the threat, calling it impossible and ordering Galland to stop reporting such intelligence. By the time the crisis became undeniable, it was far too late. The Luftwaffe fighter force had been shattered, with thousands of pilots killed, the most experienced leaders dead, and the training pipeline collapsed. This represents how command failures manifest in warfare, not through dramatic betrayals or obvious incompetence, but through the refusal to accept uncomfortable intelligence, through dismissing evidence that contradicts existing assumptions, through punishing subordinates who report problems instead of addressing the problems themselves, and through giving orders that deny reality rather than adapting to changed circumstances. Adolf Galland attempted to warn his superiors, presenting facts and recommending solutions. He was ignored, and thousands of German pilots died as a result, fighting an enemy they had been told did not exist until it was far too late to prepare an effective defense.